Afternoon, everyone. Thanks very much for joining us for A+D Thursdays today. It is a bittersweet day. It's our last installment of our public lecture series this semester. It's been a real privilege to get to teach this course and curate this lecture series in collaboration with my co-instructors, Kyle Steinfeld and Bjorn Hartman. We're extremely grateful to the Arts and Design Initiative here on campus, which have developed this really innovative bit of curriculum and programming and offered quite a bit of support to us along the way, including Catherine, who's here representing them today. I'd also like to thank the team here at BAMPFA, who, without them, this would be a much less pleasant experience for us, our speakers, and our audiences. So, led by Sean and Taylor, they've done a really incredible job of shepherding us through this term. While Amy's talk today is our last official event as part of the series, as you all know, perhaps Berkeley, we've been forced to be quite what we're calling resilient over the course of this semester in the wake of a few power outages, which impacted our series. Gratefully, we were able to reschedule one of those events. So for those of you who might be interested, tomorrow at noon at Jacobs Hall, the home of the Jacobs Institute on campus, Asa Raskin of the Center for Humane Technology will be giving his lecture that was intended as part of this series tomorrow at noon. So you can find more at programs.jacobshall.org. But to the business at hand, I'm really thrilled and honored to be able to introduce Amy Francheschini today. Amy, as you know, is a co-founder of the group Futurefarmers. She received her bachelor's in fine art from San Francisco State University, studying photography, went on to study at Stanford and earn her MFA. In 1995, she co-founded Futurefarmers, an international collective of artists, activists, researchers, farmers, and architects based here in San Francisco, but active around the world. Together, they work to propose alternatives to the social, political, and environmental organization of space. Through her work with Futurefarmers, Amy has reframed issues including sustainability, land use, agriculture, and urban and rural development through the considered performance of everyday acts: walking, talking, learning, playing, baking, and eating in dialogue with an evolving network of expert collaborators and engaged communities. These acts are transformed, as we'll see, through an extremely novel set of spatial and narrative techniques that connect localized acts to broader imaginaries of history, environment, and community, spurring new reflections on possibilities for living. The work of Futurefarmers has been shown at the Whitney, the Walker, New York MOMA, SF MOMA, the Guggenheim, the Maxi in Rome, and elsewhere, and was recently the subject of a major retrospective here in the Bay at YVCA. Personally, Amy has taught at the California College of the Arts in San Francisco and at Stanford, and she was a 2009 Guggenheim Fellow. So on that note, please join me in welcoming Amy.
Thank you for coming to this lunch hour happening, and I want to thank Robert for inviting me and just continued support as a member of different cultural institutions. It's nice to have long-term support from people like Robert. So today we're going to do something together. The title of the lecture is Presence as Practice. So I'm going to show one project, a long project, that lasted 8 years, and within that 8 years, it really unravels a lot of the types of work that Futurefarmers does. So it's many different types of work in one project. But before I do that, like Robert said, I'm one of many Futurefarmers. One of them is putting parking money in the meter. We don't have a boat yet, but we have a car out there. Lode Rankin, who's visiting from Belgium, and he'll take part in Q&A. But Futurefarmers is a group, like Robert said, that really became a group through an artist in residency program that I started in 1994, where we would invite artists into the studio, or designers or engineers, to collaborate on a new project together that was about skill sharing and pushing each other's boundaries of what we knew and crossing kind of disciplinary boundaries. Futurefarmers was a design studio during the early .com era. And with the profit we made from design, we made art projects and supported this artist in residency program. And from that, a network of collaborators has emerged and been with us. And this is just a portrait of the people, places, and projects of Futurefarmers, 1994 to last year. But before I start the talk, I'm going to wander out on stage. And when you came in, you were given a piece of paper and a little card. And we're going to go on a journey today together. We're already on the ship. We've made it on this great mothership. I don't know, has anyone seen Fellini's The Ship Sails On? Beautiful scene in the boiler room where the workers are putting coal into the oven and the opera singers are up at the top. I feel like I'm one of the workers right now. Near all the beautiful opera singers. But what I'd like to do is we're going on this journey together, and I don't know who you are. And when you're on a journey together, you kind of need to know like your skills. And if something goes wrong, we're going to call upon you and say, you know, you can cook bacon really well, and you have this pig on ship. The rest of the people might be like, we're not going to eat pig because we're not going to kill the pig. There might be a big discussion. But I need to know who can cook it if people need to eat. So what I want you to do is on these cards, on one side, imagine we're going to go on a 1.5-year journey on a boat. We're all there together. We'll go from Norway all the way down to Turkey to Istanbul. 1.5 years together. I want you to write a practical skill on one side. Very practical skill. Cooking, you can tie knots. Think about, we're going to get at sea. And then on the other side of the card, write something poetic or absurd, and kind of poetic skill that you might have. It might also be practical. Like a poetic skill might be like, I know Don Quixote by heart, and I can read it aloud during a storm to distract us. Something like that. So on one side, quickly, write a practical skill, and on the other side, a poetic. I'm going to give you 1 minute. Don't deliberate about it. It's just an exercise. So 20 seconds. Okay, so the ushers have kindly offered to collect the cards, so if you can pass the cards to the edges of the rows, and the ushers will collect your cards. Okay, while the cards are being collected, I need 4 archivists. On every great long journey on a ship, there's an archivist that takes note of everything that goes on during the journey, and also keeps the library moving and circulating through the body of our minds while we're not on watch. So can I have 4 archivists who will come up on stage for a moment? Volunteer archivist. There's one. Could you come forward? What's your name? Nora, could you come forward as an archivist? And archivist that this is part of our safety net. On the journey, conventional standards are quite important on the journey in terms of directions, north, south, east, west, time standards, standards of language using radio to communicate to other vessels. Futurefarmers' work is about questioning these standards and trying to find kind of the places in between standards and how standards were set. But for now, we're going to ask you to assume a direction. So, Nora, if you could face this way. Anisha, if you could feel comfortable facing this way. James, sorry, but can you face this way?
And I'm facing this way.
Yes. Do you know which direction you're facing right now?
In like actual like space?
Sure.
Oh god, I don't know.
Does anybody know what direction she's facing? West. West? Do we agree that that's west?
Well, from the audience's perspective.
Oh.
But from my perspective, this is the east. This is stage right, I believe.
West. Do you know which way you're facing now? East? Okay, so we're oriented a little bit. Do we have the cards? Yeah. Okay, so. We're going to put a microphone on for external audiences. Wait. Can you help me flip that? I'm going to go like this because it's hot. I don't have a belt, but. Okay. Maybe I can, while I do this, if you could take a little bit of that stack each.
Oh, like
Just a collection. Yeah.
We'll just kind of try and
Okay, so one thing I am going to show you a journey that I went on for a year and a half. And one thing the captain said on our journey was, before he took us on a journey, which was a group of artists and anthropologists and farmers, he said, is your crew okay with hierarchy? And some of the people in our crew were anarchists and artists. And I said, what do you mean by that? And he said, well, the captain's word is the last word, and if I order you to grab something, a rope on deck, you have to do it. We all agreed we will listen to the captain. One thing he also told us is that when we're at sea and we're trying to communicate to somebody else on the ship, the wind carries your voice away, so you have to learn to project your voice. So we're going to do a little exercise, kind of a concrete poem of the skill sets of this group, and you can kind of mix them up. And what I want you to do is go in a rotation. So you'll say one skill and just throw it on the ground. Really quickly, you'll say the skill. You don't have to do front and back.
Okay.
Throw it on the ground, and then you'll say the next skill, throw it on the ground. So it'll be like bing, bong, until they're done. Is that clear?
Okay.
I might stop you if we don't hear you well enough, but really think about facing in your direction. And as an audience, you'll kind of experience the difference of projection. Project your voice if you're at sea and you need to convey this information to all of us. So I'll ask you to start.
Hand cook, bake, kind of.
I can play the violin.
I can sail a boat.
Woodworking. Fitting into tight spaces.
I can fix things.
I can't read this. Hand sewing.
Vegetarian cooking. Cleaning.
I can support people in being more present and creative.
Dancing.
Electronics engineering. Lick my nose.
Rhythm making.
Make scrambled eggs.
Ready flip, cross-stitch, origami frogs. Make interactive websites.
Being the spiritual guide for the ship.
Medicine and first aid. I'm a pharmacist in Italy.
Can we wait one second? Nora, you need to project a little more.
How to make scrambled eggs with apples. I'm an artist. I can draw something inspiring.
Can sing Pretty Hurts by Beyonce by heart.
Okay, let's pause. Could you just rotate one position and continue?
Do we leave the cards?
Yeah, the cards are at sea. They're gone.
Oh, me. Fun. Childcare. This is a practical skill.
Map maker, navigator.
Willing to die so the crew can eat my body.
I can kind of dance?
If you need to jump over a crack and feel like you cannot, you can look at me in the eyes.
Okay, let's do one more rotation. And when you, this time let's speed it up a little bit and continue the projection. So one more rotation to your right. Yeah.
Noticing beauty.
I know all the lyrics to All Star.
Talking.
Good at cleaning, detail-oriented.
Navigating by the stars.
Can write music.
Creative storage solutions.
Quasi-poetic lectures on the philosophy of art.
I can organize things.
Programming.
Draw a satire image.
Fixing broken things.
Translating Latin.
Play clarinet.
I'm good at sewing and mending torn or ripped garments/things. Oh, ruined, sorry.
Cooking.
Organizing people.
Stand-up comedy.
I can die on command. Practical.
Cleaning.
Language skill.
Lifting heavy objects.
Cooking.
Okay.
I can sew, which may be helpful for mending clothes. Or
One
sales.
last rotation, and then we'll finish them off and end.
Money management.
One more rotation. Whoop.
Cleaning surfaces really well.
I'll laugh you out of your misery.
I know how to do breathing exercises to relax myself.
Can cook.
I can cry a lot.
I can lead dancing.
Cooking, fishing, and sleeping.
Practical foraging.
Knitting mittens.
Oh, I'm out of cards. Cleaning.
Computers.
I can move very slowly, sometimes without trying.
Emulate an owl how hooty.
Can cook rice.
Listening.
Okay, I'm going to have us pause and let us imagine the last ones in our hands. And just give a thanks to our archivists. You can go back on deck. Thank you. You can drop them at no, you can leave them. You can leave them. It's important. You can just scatter them.
Okay, cool.
Scatter them. Thank you so much. So I collected a few that are very important, and we might need to use them during the talk. One more thing we need before we leave is a captain. Does anyone here know how to sail a sailboat? What's your name?
Spencer.
Spencer. I'm going to pass this rope to you. You can stay there, but we're going to pass this out to you. If you could pass this up to Spencer. Is anyone else a captain, just in case? Who? Is there someone over here who can sail a boat? What's your name? Trudy. Anyone else? Okay, this is great because it's really nice to have two captains. We're going to pass one up to Spencer, and I'm going to bring the other end. Actually, I'm going to give you a different rope. All right. For now, we're already at sea, but we're hoping you know how to tie us on to the docks when we get to port in a few minutes. Trudy? Yeah. Trudy and Spencer, can you guys remember those names because you guys are our guides? The last thing we need is one able-bodied sailor. It's just a person who feels like if something goes on, I can grab a rope. I'll be with you on the whole journey. Can someone take, all right, what's your name?
My name's Peter.
Peter, you're sitting next to Spencer. I'm going to give you this because it's going to get really wet. If you want to bear that heat, you can put it on. Can you pass that to our abled body? Okay, I think we're ready to go. We just have to do a training video, and then we'll go. All right. I think that's, last but not least, flashlights. They're just here if we need them. Okay. So this is a training video. Some of you might have seen it already, but I'm going to show it.
I grew up on a farm in Hadley, Massachusetts, and here in the attics we found these old bicycles. This is a bone shaker before they discovered the chain and the sprocket and so forth. And I kind of trained on this sort of thing here. We found a lot of super high wheelers too, with enormous wheels. This is made for a racing bicycle for a tall man. I can't reach the pedals all the way down. But I'm getting trained for Cape Horn, and this is the one way to do it. When you put on the brakes, it's a disaster. But with a strong neck, I'm still alive and ready to climb up something that I could find on the farm nearest Cape Horn, Mass. This pole is rotten at the bottom, but it won't fall down on account of the wires. I'm swaying now, making believe I'm off the horn and getting ready for that sort of thing. But this is a kid with a one-track mind, if I ever saw one, just standing on his head to make sure he'd never be scared, as he's been reading about in the books by Jack London and so forth. I thought the books by London were factual, but they're fiction, and they had a fight on every other page. So I trained and trained. He became a wrestler, jiu-jitsu expert, acrobatic expert, and therefore never had a fight on all the voyaging I've had years later. I got ready for it on the farm before I'd even seen salt water. But now we're off for adventures, great sailing adventures aboard the Peking, and this enormous four-masted bark carrying 5,300 tons of cargo. She has 32 sails over an acre of canvas, and she's an immense, the largest sailing ship in the world at the time by about 5 tons. Those 3 lower sails each weigh a ton or more when they're dry. When they're wet or full of ice, no one knows what they weigh. But she's carrying 5,300 tons of cargo, plus about 3,000 tons of ship. That's 8,000 tons, sailed entirely by human hands. There's no motors, there's no winches, there's no switches, there's no lights, nothing but human hands to power this entire vessel, to drive it 11,000 miles where it doesn't want to go, the wrong way around Cape Horn.
Okay, so you know what we're in for. I just want to show you the size of our vessel, because we're not on that vessel. We're on, let's go back. Our vessel is this size. So we're on a 5-masted wooden sailboat right here. So it's just a really small portion of this beast that went to the Cape Horn. I think we're ready to go. Yes, we are. So, like I said, I'm going to talk about one project. Is it possible to turn the lights down just a tiny bit? It's really bright. I'm going to talk about one project called Flatbread Society, which started in 2010 in Norway, Oslo, Norway, and it was an invitation to do a permanent public art project, part of a waterfront redevelopment. The public art program was curated by Claire Doherty of a project in England called Situations. And the kind of idea for the public projects in this new waterfront development was called slow space. So she was curating projects that dealt with slowness and time. We were invited to Norway, and our journey that we're on today is anchored to a piece of land in Oslo, where there once was a farm. This was the King's Farm basically it was a port, but it was also a boat building area where the forest literally came down to the waterfront and boats were built. So it was a productive waterfront. This was a farm. It was a fertile piece of land that fed all the king's court and the builders of the boats. You can see the boats in the background there. So imagine we're at sea. A horizon absent of land. Waves, wind, and crew and able bodies move our vessel. We're moving from Oslo, and if you imagine, we are this farm that I just showed you, and we've sailed away. This farm sailed away in about the early 1900s, searching for sturdy grains that had found their way into hiding places as the revolution of industrial agriculture arose. This farm rescued hundreds of seeds and knowledge, and after nearly 100 years of sailing, she found herself back in Oslo. After so many years at sea, she had lost all her soil and was now merely a rocky island in the middle of a rough building site surrounded by roads, railway lines, and 2 ventilation towers. Strange, there's no image. Imagine 2 ventilation towers. When the locals heard that the farm was back, she experienced a small revolution. The locals formed a group and called themselves Flatbread Society. Within a few hectic weeks during spring, they installed themselves, asking the city for 150 boxes to grow food at this site, and the soil was donated from the city. 4,000 people arrived, but there were only 150 plots. This group organized themselves into a community, calling themselves the Glory, in Norwegian, Herligheten, and they installed themselves on this common land that was once a farm. Their presence piqued the interest of the developers. The developers came with big pieces of paper and pictures of their plans for this area: luxury apartments, banks, cultural institutions, football fields, and grassy areas to do things like this: yoga, relaxing by the seaside. They were going to bring in rocks to change the waterfront completely, create places for children to play. They had it all figured out, even the lighting and how people might use this space. The Flatbread Society formed a board of directors, all very civilized people, to help direct a path forward. Some of these directors were artists, some were academics. You might recognize some of the names: Amy Balkin, Neil Smith, Hendrik Lubin, Kobe Matthews. Futurefarmers installed themselves as Flatbread Society for a temporary moment and built a bakehouse, a temporary bakehouse. And this is a traditional, a bakehouse is a traditional form that's often in rural Norway, where people gather with their grains, their harvest of the year, and they mill and they bake and they store their grains for the year. And Flatbread Society thought it might be interesting to install a bakehouse in the middle of the city. They worked with an oven builder named Sten and invited people to come and build an oven and learn how to bake bread. Together they made 3 ovens, and they called it the Mothership, the idea being that this farm might bring together different cultures. There's 3 different types of baking going on here. There's a tandoor oven, a raised bread oven, or a pizza oven, and at the end is a take, which is a traditional flatbread oven that's just a fire and a piece of iron. And between was a heated seat bench. And in Oslo, there's quite a diverse community of immigrants and locals. And we thought that flatbread might be a currency that could move between these different cultures, and that having a mothership of 3 different cultures of bread might bring people together that wouldn't normally come together. People came together of all sorts. This was a climate change conference where 70 people came down to the waterfront to have a tactile experience and organize around the climate crisis. Other activists, these were seed activists who came and used this site as a gathering place after a demonstration demanding that the EU doesn't privatize seeds and allows seeds to stay in the open hands of farmers rather than the small collection of private enterprises, which we know some of them here locally, Monsanto. Teenagers came from many different places and immediately identified with the tandoor oven, and were making flatbread of all different recipes and commingling and wanting this to be a place of business. Flatbread Society expanded after this temporary presence into a field that was a grain field dedicated to seeds that had fallen out of production in the late 1800s and were now still in the hands of the open source farmers. And we seeded this piece of land with this group of demonstrators in the summer of 2013. The press came, which the press started to become this broadcasting, this extension of the broadcasting of the seeds that we were doing. And from this point, the metaphor of broadcasting and propagation became very seminal in this work, which you'll see later. It was very important for press to be part of this process because Flatbread Society was trying to convince the city to use this piece of property that was being developed in the waterfront to be a permanent farm and an agricultural commons rather than a football field or a fancy waterfront recreation area. This is a picture of one of the grains that we were growing and the farmer that we collaborated with for 8 years. His name is Johann Sward. And he and a historian rescued an ancient grain. People don't like to call them ancient grains anymore. They like to call them farmers' grains. This was a rye that was grown by a group of nomadic Finnish peoples up until the late 1800s. And they would store their grains in their saunas. And a historian in the 70s thought, maybe we could find one of these saunas and maybe there's some of those grains left, because if they could grow rye this north, it's quite a special rye. So Johann and Per Martin Svensberg went and they found an old sauna and they got permission to take it apart. And they found 9 grains between 2 boards in the roof. And they planted those 9 grains, and from those 9 grains, 7 germinated, and from those 7, they reintroduced these back into production in Norway, and now they've spread them around to Sweden and Denmark, and we've spread them further to Belgium. But they're very special. They grow 3 meters high. It takes 2 years for them to grow. So the first year, 1 seed becomes 12 tufts of grass. It dies, and it fertilizes itself, and then the next year it grows up as 12 grains, holding 1,000 grains per head. So that's pretty good profit margin compared to our cash systems. Johann always said, we do not need museums to conserve varieties. What we want is to grow them. And what he meant was, often these old seeds are left in gene banks. And if scientists have time, they just try to keep the pure genetic life of that seed as it was when it was found. But they often don't have time to do that. So farmers like Johann and others are taking these grains out of the gene banks and growing them so that they can adapt to the current climate, social desires, soil changes, and then they send them back to the gene banks. But this kind of became an operating ethos for us, this idea that, of course, museums are very important, but it's also important to grow these things. And as artists who like to work in the world, but with museums, it became kind of a trajectory for us. So the grains, these grains represented a sort of slowness, especially in this backdrop of this waterfront that was being developed, and it's full of banks and multinational companies and invisible economy back in the background. We were trying to bring something more tactile to this place. Here's a picture of the sauna. So this is one of the Finnish saunas where they would bathe, but then they'd also use it to store the grains and their flatbread. So this was how this was actually how grain was stored. So they would turn it into a flatbread, and it could keep for up to 20 years. This is a picture of just the germination of the field. And Flatbread Society created a suite of tools to continue to have a conversation with the city government and our commissioners. This was a telescope rolling pin to think about how do we see further than our personal capabilities, what are those tools we create to do that, how do we look forward but also pay attention to the everyday of bread baking and engaging with the grains. We also created a Canoe Oven, which we used to broadcast the project further in the city of Oslo. So we would row around. Loda's here, one of the rowers, and Stein. We would row around Oslo and then go up into neighborhoods and talk to people about how they related to this waterfront development, because it was a huge project in Oslo. It was a huge change in their waterfront. And Oslo presented it as their project that made them a global city. When we would land on different places, this is Marta Van Dessel, another collaborator. We had a radio program, so we would record the conversations and then broadcast this on the internet. The microphone is embedded in a baguette to make it a little more approachable. Flatbread Society assembled gatherings to think together with the locals on the form and the function of a bakehouse, a permanent bakehouse and a permanent agricultural commons. We literally baked our ideas in the temporary bakehouse, so we invited lawyers who are focused on the commons, urban theorists, gardeners, yoga teachers, musicians, students, a big of diversity of people we could to co-imagine what this space could be. One of the big questions was, is this bakehouse going to be completely open with no keys, or will it be closed and we come up with a working system together of who has access, when, and how? So this was a continuum of ideas between fully open and fully closed system of the bakehouse. From this point on, the city said, we love what you're doing. What would it look like? What do you need to have a permanent agricultural commons? And we said, we need soil, badly. But instead of just bringing soil in from somewhere else, we sent out handwritten postcards to 70 different farmers surrounding Oslo and invited them in 2015 to come to the city and process a symbolic amount of soil onto the land. So 75 postcards were sent out, 72 people came. And we met at the edge of the city and we walked through the city bringing the soil to the waterfront. People came with their wheelbarrows, people came with their donkeys, their chickens. The king donated 9 tons of soil in his fancy truck. And Flatbread Society produced this really huge cloth flatbread and invited everyone to put 1 handful of soil from each farmer into this mix and create a new culture, which was named on that day by the people, called Losetter, which is a Norwegian word for a common in the city. There's a side note on that that's local. I don't know if anyone knows Ignacio Chapela, teaching at UC Berkeley, but he helped consult with us on this soil mixture because some of the soil scientists thought it was blasphemous to put all this soil together. But Ignacio said the symbolic action of it is more powerful, do it. So I thank him. We did a ritual where we mixed it all together, we threw it up, and then we named it. And we created a land use declaration together, which asked the city to create this space as a new cultural institution called Losetter that would be dedicated to farming and art. And on this waterfront, the National Opera is there, the National Library, the Munch Museum, and then this piece of land sits near that. So all of these cultural institutions were there. We asked if we could also be one. There's Johan Sward. We asked him to be the first to sign the document. And then, of course, this new soil was the witness to all of these signatures. So Losetter became formalized on that day, and it became quite an active space and a kind of a symbol of hope in this strange environment. It's very hard to get there, and once you get there, it's hard to get out, and people are like, what? Where have I landed? So this became a farm, a community garden, and in 2015, we began to build a permanent bakehouse. This morning, someone sent us a link from a Dutch television station that uses this project as an example of how people can make change in cities. We don't know how it got there, but it's broadcasting around. This in Dutch says, to be able to be where we can do something to change. So this in 2015, we had soil. It wasn't the healthiest soil, but things were growing. People were arriving. Beekeepers came unsolicited. They started beekeeping. They also started a training program and started doing business with surrounding neighbors, putting beehives on roofs. Local farmers would drive by to deliver their food to the city. They saw the farm, and they said, hey, do you need horses to plow your field? We'll bring horses. So there's a farmer now that comes once a year and plows the field. We partnered with the Norwegian Farmers Union and convinced them to hire a city farmer. So this is the first city farmer hired by the National Farmers Coalition, who's a very conservative organization and had never even used the word organic before. I know in California organic is not a great word, but in Norway, organic was a bad word. It's not standardized enough. But through our relationship with the Norwegian Farmers Union, they softened, and now they have a program of hiring city farmers in different cities. So this is Andreas, who was our first farmer for 3 years, and we took a portion of our art funding and made a salary. So we split it with the Farmers Union, and now we have a new farmer and another half-time farmer. So Flatbread Society wanted to build a meeting place that paid homage to this history of this place being a boat-building port. So we partnered with some boat builders, and we used muscles and steam to bend wood and form the hull of a ship that was referencing an 1895 rescue boat that we'd often see in the port of Oslo that was designed by Colin Archer, whose job it was to go and rescue boats in distress. So she's a slow and steady boat, and we liked this idea of rescue. The Latin meaning of rescue is to return, and somehow we thought this form of the boat and these grains that we were kind of rescuing from rooftops, later on from suitcases found in old barns, was a nice metaphor. So in 2016, we erected the bakehouse as a permanent structure. So one side is a baking area, and the other side is a meeting area, and then in the winter it's closed and it becomes a propagation house. So inside the hull of this bakehouse, instead of an engine, we put 3 wood-fired ovens based on that temporary version that I saw you. And we insulated her with the earth from the ground there. So this is the propagation side. And surrounding her is a grain field. So it's a rotating grain field. As we get new collections, we plant them there, and then we distribute them to other farmers. But it's not a production field. It's a place to get grains back into production, and then to share this idea of we don't need a museum to grow varieties, to preserve varieties. What we want to do is grow them. So it's a way of exciting people's interest. So on one side of the bakehouse is the fjord, and on the other side is this new development of Bjørvika, that's what it's called. So the bakehouse points to the past and to the future, extending metaphors of cultivation and sailing to larger ideas of self-reliance and foregrounding of organic processes in the development of land use, social relations, and cultural forms. So the bakehouse has taken on a life of its own. People program it daily. There's a bakers union now that has taken over it and opens the doors and teaches people to bake once a week. A group of women started a medicinal herb garden. They cure herbs. They teach people how to use them. People don't know who Futurefarmers or Flatbread Society is anymore. It's great. In 2016, Futurefarmers wanted to kind of depart. As this community was gluing, we needed to kind of separate and see how there was no reliance on us anymore. So we proposed to take the first harvest of grains on a trip, on a reverse journey back to the Middle East where the grains were first domesticated. So we had a procession of the first harvest, and everyone who had worked with us over the 5 years brought provisions and gifts and sent us off. And we held the finish rye in this timepiece as a kind of memory of the beginnings of our journey in Oslo. So everything was put onto our Mothership, which we're now on, the grains, the provisions, and we sailed off on an 1895 rescue boat. So we were on the Christiania. Christiania was the original name of Oslo before Oslo. Oslo was called Christiania. And this is rescue boat number 10. So Sea Journey enacts a reverse migration on this wooden boat. This slow and safe boat connects to ideas of exploration and loss, to new ideas of rescue and findings. It retraces the roots of these seeds and their cultures, which resignifies these voyages from the 21st century vantage of having lost our flotation, lost our way, a reverse Nansen, a reverse Humboldt, a reverse Darwin, Cook, Marconi, Galvani, Magellan, or whatever traveler you may choose. These are the words of Ignacio Chapella, who joined us on the tour. So we were sent off by 3 sister vessels. So there's a fleet of these rescue boats. They came and they sent us off. And we went from Oslo to Istanbul over a course of a year and a half. A rotating group of artists, anthropologists, bakers, farmers, and a constellation of host institutions that were sort of our lighthouses in this journey. We can speak of this voyage as a return or a retracing of a very ancient route, combining human and non-human initiative by which wheat was domesticated from the wild and then slowly made its way through gifts, trade winds, and sea currents from the highly cultured Middle East to the barbarians of the North. These are the words of Michael Taussig, who was one of our crew members, an anthropologist working at Columbia University. So this journey was quite new, a use of new muscles in terms of time and space. We were a crew of 8, on this small vessel that took turns rotating through shifts of 4 hours. At the end of each 4 hours, we had to log the wind, the currents, time over water, and any notes that happened on this day. It's a traditional logbook, our captain knows. And get used to being at sea. So I'll just play like a section woo! See, that's how it is at sea. You never know. That's really how it is at sea. You have a plan, and it's always interrupted by currents or shift of wind. So let's go. Maybe we won't go to sea. We'll try once more, and then if we don't make it, we'll try something else. Let's see, view, presenter view. Let's try. So I think you all may have been at sea, but this was just a typical, actually very nice day at sea, and I think someone said they could clean surfaces really well. And one of the main jobs when you weren't on watch and you weren't sleeping was to clean the decks and to keep them wet. So these are unfinished decks, so the seawater actually preserves them. So a big job was always fishing for water and keeping the decks clean. So abled body, you can start doing that now. No, you can just do it in your mind, yes. Sea Journey was described as a museum event by Michael Taussig and a few other people, and it was really supported by museums along the route, but it also operated at sea as a schoolhouse, as a host environment. We often picked people up and moved them from port to port. Some people just found out we were in their location, and this is Andrew Forbes, who's a radical kind of feral farmer in London who brings these seeds out of the gene banks and plants them in public parks in London and then sends them back to the gene banks. And now it's formalized and it's actually supported, but he started just putting them in Ruskin Park and other parks. And he heard we were coming through the Thames River, so he jumped on and he brought us some seeds that he wanted us to take to Wales that hadn't been planted in 60 years. And he told a lot of stories about the Thames and the history of grains moving up the Thames. So it was very much open to chance, and I think we were lucky to have institutions that supported this unknown of what the programming was going to be. And also our captains who, another thing they said is we cannot be stuck on time. It won't be a fun expedition if we have to be places at a certain time. That's hard for institutions too, but it really, you can't be any place at a certain time, especially on a mostly wind-driven ship. We also had Kate Rich, who's an artist in England. She jumped on board. She does a project called Feral Trade, which is using informal networks of movement, people traveling to move goods around the planet. And we had a mast on the board that we would use as an antenna. So radio antennas are called masts. Marta Van Dessel was our onboard radio operator. So when we would come into port, she would launch a wire at the top of the mast, and then we would broadcast interviews that we had done on board. And a sphere of analogies began to emerge relating to farming and radio communication. Broadcasting, etymologically, refers to a sowing technique, right? Scattering seeds. Not one-to-many spreading seeds of information, but circulating locally in terms of circuits and citizens being present in Hertzsche waves. Propagating is creating plants from seeds, cutting, and bulbs. It's also a term in radio where waves travel from one point to the next by the sun and the reflection of the ionosphere. So we started to tune into these different frequencies of land-based ideas of broadcasting and ideas of broadcasting and propagation in the electromagnetic sphere, because radio was something we really depended on the boat. Each day we would gather around a radio, and we would do a voice logbook as well as a written logbook, and this was also broadcast in local ports. I don't think, I'll just zip through a few more because we're getting short on time. The land is beautiful. the sky is beautiful, when will they meet? Question mark. So this voyage was a retracing. It was also a mode of collecting stories and seeds that we would trade between farmers and institutions. So at each site, we would do a seed ceremony where we would bring the seeds from our port before and share with the new port, and then carry those grains further. We would document each grain and then seal each collection, a portion of each collection, into a vessel in case we went under. These seeds would float somewhere and maybe someone would find them. The grains also found their ways into cultural institutions, so it was a nice challenge to be at sea and collecting and then to formalize each collection at an institution. So each seed started to acquire a formalized seed story, like the Finnish grain I told you about. We have several stories now. And sometimes the exhibitions were at places where we weren't even physically there. So we exhibited Seed Journey at the Sharjah Biennale in the form of a mast filled with seeds, and then a display of seeds, and then images. You can't see it very well, but I'll show you in a second. This was a television, and we were sending images via SSTV, which is actually sending images through radio transmission. So we would send, when we would have radio on board, we would send images that would be streamed to this television. And then we asked if we could extend the mast through the institution, because we always like to pierce the walls of the institution. And this mast became a radio that was broadcasting transmissions from the Seed Journey. And here's some of the images that we were sending. So SSTV works by breaking down the image line by line, bit by bit, and I thought since this lecture series was called Buildings and Bits, might be nice to think about bits. And it has a sound related to it, so I'll play the sound, I hope. So the sound is basically associated with, does anybody here, where's our friend, our electronic friend? Can anybody here explain SSTV in a more nerdy way? Anyone here? No. Anyone feel comfortable with SSTV, slow scan television, and how it works? Brains working? Okay, we'll come back to that. But basically, it's taking an image, breaking it into sound bites, and then you have to have a program that can read this sound and translate it back into an image. So this is something we learned from an amateur radio group in Jersey Island that we visited, and we would send images back and forth to them. We also had analog transmissions in the form of postcards. So we would send postcards to Michael Taussig in wherever he was, because he was a remote crew member often, and then he would respond, and we would send a drawing and kind of a reflection of the day, and he would respond back. So this is a series of 24 of those transmissions sent by postcard. And there's a tradition in radio where when you would send a transmission, you would follow that transmission with a postcard, or the person who received that transmission would send you a postcard saying, "I received your transmission." So these were called QR cards. So we kind of QSL cards. We followed that tradition of in how we designed these cards. So it would be the call number and the location, and then the message that was sent, you would get sent back as a postcard. So these were presented in Sharjah, and people could take them away for free, so we were thinking them, again, as propagating this project in a different means. I'm just going to go quickly, and then I'm going to finish with one thing. So we went to Wales, and the National Library welcomed us to exchange these grains from England that had not been seen for 60 years. So the BBC came, and this was kind of a day of celebration to receive these back. We would meet in old water mills that had been rehabilitated to kind of rebuild local economies around grain. So we would gather the grains and then go with canoe back to our mothership. And then we had a suite of sculptures that we had. So I showed you this container that we would seal the bottles in, or seal the seeds in. And we had this miniature version of the rescue boat that was our rescue boat, or the seeds rescue boat, that would carry these seeds further if we were to go down. Seed Journey went on to land in Spain, in Santander. Ignacio Chapela came, and we transitioned off the boat onto land for financial reasons, and also embracing that seeds actually move through many different means. People came with provisions and asked us to take other things on our journey, like corn, rather than just grain. Apple trees. And Ignacio Chapela took our collection and went for a 7-day journey to kickstart this land-based aspect of Seed Journey. So this is in the Picos de Europa, where he and 2 students from Berkeley walked and encountered shepherds along the way who also are growing grains in the high altitudes, so they exchange seeds. And then, the story never ends, we were asked to do a retrospective at Yerba Buena. And I think one of the challenges for us is, how do you translate this dynamic out at sea environment into a museum experience for an audience who hasn't been there? You know, how do you do that? I don't know that we've answered that question, but Yerba Buena was open to us kind of thinking about how to do that. I don't know if anyone went, but we transformed Gallery 2 into a space that had some sort of artifacts of things we had experienced at sea. So the deck of the boat was really a stage. So we asked to build this stage in the middle of the room. Fog was a big protagonist in our journey. If you hit a wall of fog, all your perceptual apparatus shifts, and sound is basically the only thing you can navigate with. Bells on buoys become really important. Radio, again, is very important. So we installed a network of tea kettles in the middle of the stage that would go off once a day and create this fog by boiling. We also were paying homage to San Francisco fog. And also every morning when you get up after your shift, and we did have electricity on board, the boiling of the water for the coffee was something that everyone was around. We had 5 sails of a ship that wasn't ours, and we proposed to the museum, can we use this space as a space of production over a course of 3 months and kind of see what happens? Can we start with some tools and materials that relate to our project and see what happens? So this is a stack of a tree that was fell. It's a Montreal pine, which is a great fog harvester. And then this is an old sewing machine, 1895 sewing machine, which is the same year that our boat was built, and also the same year that kind of seeds started to fall out of production. And so that was a reference for us. So every weekend we would gather, and we had a series called the Galileo Smoking Club. We made fake ceramic cigarettes. And the first gathering, we said, we need foghorns. Let's try to make some foghorns. So these are some CCA design students who we continue to work with, Alexander and Benner, who made a series of foghorns just from funnels and PVC pipes. And then we would just kind of see, how do we engage with the space, with these sounds? The underside of the stage became really important to us and exciting. And then every month we would have a public event to share what we had done in that space. So we have some of the actors here in the stage, but I'll play a segment from that. called us in with the donkeys, who are our current archivists for Futurefarmers. And thank you for this moment. Before we end, though, we need to return to port, because I know everyone has to go back to class and work and things. Captains, can you guys come forward and just tie us off? I forgot your names already. What's your name? Spencer, can you tie us off? And Trudy, can you tie us off? And maybe you can just tell us what knots you're using. You can tie us to the railing there. That's fixed institutional architecture, so you can be safe. Yeah, maybe if you want to come up here, so great. They have really nice piers here. What knot are you going to use?
A good old double knot.
Double knot, okay. What did you use, Trudy? Bowline. Okay, thank you guys. We're back. You can start with questions if you like.
Now that we're tied off, the ushers should have microphones. If you want to raise your hand if you have a question, I think Amy and hopefully Loda are some of our questions.
Why were the saunas good for storage?
So that's a good question. So they actually built the saunas with a peaked roof, which you don't need. So it was just thinking about all the heat that rises in the sauna is a place that is very dry. It doesn't make it wasn't a wet sauna. It was a dry sauna. So it's a dry place, and it's away from the mice. So it's a safe storage space. Brian Carl? Oh.
I might have missed your explanation, but what was up with the nail polish?
Good question. So, wow, it's a long story. But that was a retrospective that you saw at the Yerba Buena, and that was kind of an inside joke. But on many of the journeys that we were reading about, there was often people played chess to pass time on long expeditions. Futurefarmers has a long relationship to chess. We did a show at Yerba Buena years ago where we replayed the game of Deep Blue versus Kasparov, where the computer first beat a human. And we had a whole range of talks around that, kind of the consequences of that, the shift in our perception of machine learning. So we replayed that Deep Blue versus Kasparov game, but the pieces were fingernail polish, and that was just something that Yossi, who wrote a program, so that was a glass table. The pieces were fingernail polish, so every time a piece was moved, a beam of light would go through the table and trigger a sensor and make a sound. So the soundscape you heard was made from playing of this chessboard. Thanks for the question. There was another question over there, I thought. That was your question. You had Brian answer. Okay.
You mentioned the donkeys very briefly at the tail end, but maybe you could elaborate a little bit more on how they fit into the whole scheme of things?
Please. No. Well, that's also a long story. Are you ready? Okay, so when we negotiate with institutions as a collective, we're an art group of 4 to 10 people, it doesn't always fit into an institutional framework. It's quite difficult, and you have to be very stubborn as an artist to try to maintain the kind of level of complexity that exists in a group like us, or in the way we work, and to try not to simplify it in a way. But of course, the institution's job is to communicate to various audiences, and we appreciate that. But at Yerba Buena, we really had to become donkeys. Like, we had to be very stubborn. So stubborn that, in fact, we said, can we have some donkeys in the show? We couldn't have live donkeys, but we asked if we could have 2 donkeys present, because we felt like our work is so alive. It's so about the moment and every day and the mess of who knows if our archivists are going to be comfortable up here. Like, a lot of chance involved. So, there's also kind of a rawness to the donkey, and we work with the anthropologist Michael Taussig a lot, and he was working simultaneously on a piece called The Cry of the Burro. And he was really talking about this cry of the donkey that is kind of a representation of his idea of the mastery of non-mastery. So it's this beast that hasn't been fully domesticated. It kind of refuses domestication. It's stubborn. And we like to live in that place of like resisting the standards of measurement that we use or direction and kind of rethink what do those standards do to us and how can we find places where we just maybe use a different way of operating for a moment and how that might reinform the standards we work within. There's a longer. We've done a performance. We actually did a performance with Taussig in the anthropology department here, performing his lecture called The Cry of the Burrow. And I think it's online. There's an experimental architectural lab here, EAL, and they do performative projects.
I heard you mention that you traded seeds. Was it at all on your mind that like you'd be introducing alien species to different ecosystems and disrupting that?
That's another big conversation. No, that wasn't a question, but our plan did shift. Our plan was to gather all the seeds along the journey and then plant them in Istanbul in a bostan, like a community garden. But it's a big shock for a Norwegian Finnish rye to be planted in Istanbul, like right away after it hasn't been even in that region maybe genetically for hundreds of years. So it became more interesting to bring seeds from Oslo to Denmark, trade, get seeds from Denmark to England, trade. I think the alien species conversation is like a large can of worms. I think with these grains, there's not the potential for them to cross-pollinate and contaminate as much as maybe a different variety of plant life. The one thing that this project kind of reaffirmed or made really clear, and it seems very obvious, is if there is a moment where industrial ag shifts to a smaller scale form of farming, we don't actually have the seed stock to grow food to feed as many people as we want. So these farmers' work are really essential to getting these seeds back into production and adapting to local environments. Yes.
I truly, truly loved this journey. Thank you for sharing such a beautiful and moving journey with us. And I wanted to ask if there's perhaps a more accessible but still deeply aspirational and connective journey that you think we all ought to go on.
Wow. Loda can answer that question. I think that's for you to decide on your own, just to pay attention to what drives you and I think I'm currently teaching in a master's program in South Tyrol in Bolzano, Italy. It's a master's in eco-social design. And all of the students ask this question. They're graduate students who have dropped out of industry. You know, they've been fashion designers or product designers. And they're really asking this question. And I think what we've tried to say is like, think very locally, even like to your body scale. What do you like to do? What can you do? And then you'll know what to do. Robert, and then you had a question.
I just wanted to return to this idea of non-mastery that you introduced in talking about the image here. Across our series, we've been talking a lot about methods and strategies and relations that can help us make design look quite different. And I think in your work, you're building relations in two regards. One in the kind of maintenance but also expansion and narrowing and evolution of a collective, but then also in all of these external relations that you build along the way. I was really fascinated by the moment of kind of ending that you introduced in the context of Oslo, right? The nurturance of possibilities there, and then the act of stepping back. I think given our conversations, it would be really wonderful to hear a bit about how you conceive of the maintenance and change of those different relationships over time.
Do you want to talk about it? Do you want to talk about it? Okay, I can use the podium. Yeah. So the maintenance issues are a really good question because we had never done such a large scale or long-term project, and it's so tender because you're building relationships all the time, and without those relationships, the project doesn't work. And it's the presence as practice was like we gave our lives to that project. We lived there quite often. We would drop out of our lives and live together for 6 months in Oslo, and we would not act, but really be active citizens and go to people's projects and indulge in communities we maybe wouldn't normally enter into, and try to find a way that, like, as an outsider, actually it kind of helped to not have prejudgments or the history of maybe conflicts. And I think that there was a tender moment in 2015 so every year we would do a kind of large-scale public program to kind of reinsert some art into the project, because often it would become just an urban farm, as our commissioners would say, where's the art? So we would try to bring some weirdness in, and it was exciting for people. And one year we curated a film screening and many programs, and the beekeepers started to do art. And we had to go to a meeting with the Norwegian Farmers Union and the commissioners, and we couldn't come to that public program. And the beekeeper was very upset, like, you didn't come to my program. And we said, Marius, we're not doing this project. You shouldn't be making projects for us. It's a space, and it has to go like further than Futurefarmers. And it was just a moment where we were like, whoa, we need to step back and not think that every year we come back to do this cultural thing, that it's like, what's Futurefarmers gonna bring? So we started to kind of massage the core group that had been with us, not by any written commitment, it's just they were there for years upon years, and they started their projects at the site, they grew into businesses. To say, hey, you guys, we stewarded this together, and for it to be a permanent project, you guys need to have a stronger voice. And so the core group started to meet, and in fact, they didn't like the name core group, so they changed their name. They started to organize, and they saw that it is their project, and they have a great opportunity to take it on as permanent Oslo residents. So it was a conversation, and just a paying attention to like that tender moment. And now it's really functioning on its own. Like it's so nice. We were stuck in Oslo a few months ago in an airplane dilemma. So we just went in to visit it, and it was this lively place full of events and people and all kinds of people. And it was really nice to kind of go there without people knowing who we were. There's a question there, and then we'll ask your question.
So as you just kind of described, this project it really involved your entire self. It was your life for a long period of time. And I guess what I'm curious about is, especially during the time you were at sea, this project, though it is an art project, it really, your 24/7, your whole entity is here in this place, doing this thing, and there's not really an ability to just kind of like take a step back and go back to somewhere that's familiar or comfortable. So what I'm wondering is, throughout that, what kind of were the biggest emotional, personal, I mean, without being too probing or invasive, like, although I guess I kind of am being that way, like, what were those difficulties? And I don't know. And yeah, what did you learn throughout the process?
I think one thing we had on our side is that there's a really strong winter period in Oslo where you can't do anything on the site. So, and actually, the bakehouse is a seasonal building, but the core group demands to use it in the winter, so they still use it. But it doesn't have a responsibility to be open and programmed in the winter. So we had that on our side. We could go back to San Francisco in our other lives, teach, do architecture, and then come back. And that was actually a nice rhythm to kind of have a break and then come back with fresh energy and perspectives. I think the thing that's hard for us now is we're invited to do similar projects by cities and villages and other places who expect us to do something like this in 6 months. And we were super fortunate that we had a commissioner, we had a budget, we had a situation that allowed for a lot of time. Like the first 2 years was really just research and being present, wandering around, like seeing who we're gonna meet. They didn't even demand us to tell us what we would do yet until like the end of year and a half. So I think the thing we've learned is like if we're gonna do something on this scale, the conditions have to be really well decided upon. And then how to do smaller scale projects, like how not to throw yourself into something that deeply, and what is a smaller scale. It's like we kind of struggled with the recent project in Norway. We did another project in the north, and it's like, how do you do something in a 3-month period of time with the community? Like it's a very different thing to do something on a 3-month scale versus a 10-year scale. Captain Trudy.
Thank you so much for your talk. Something I was just curious to hear you elaborate on is sort of the establishment of the site, and you spoke about how the government was very supportive of this, but there was like a whole development that happened, and I was curious about the sort of negotiation process, like, you know, yeah, just elaborating on that a little bit more, and like tensions and negotiations that had to occur through that.
So I think it's a really good question, because when we first were invited to do this project, we were sent a whole bunch of aerial shots like this, as if we would be familiar with the site enough to do a project. You know, like we were in San Francisco and they're like, here's where you're gonna work. And they were redeveloping the whole area from that cruise ship all the way to this white box. And within the development were common areas. So in Norway, the idea of commons is very strong. It's a national right in the constitution that you have the right to cross your land, to roam, free access to all the waterfronts. So they wanted this area to have common spaces. I think when we were invited there, the first thing that was built was this wall of skyscrapers called the Barcode. And what it did is it blocked the view of many people that live in Oslo, and one kind of natural law they have there is that every person in Oslo has the right to see the fjord from their home, and this cut that off immediately. So that I think it was 78% of the population when we got there hated this waterfront development. The arts community was like, you guys aren't artists if you work there. Like, you guys are commercial. You know, like, there was a tension. And I was thinking, if this happened in San Francisco, would I participate or would I be protesting such a development? So that's why we formed this not adversarial, but advisory council I showed you pictures of. Because I actually felt uncomfortable there. And so I asked Neil Smith, who's a geographer, colleague of David Harvey, deals a lot with gentrification. We'd worked with him before, and I told him the conditions, and he was like, you have to do that project. Like, you have a potential to sit at table with people and change things. Like, if you don't do it, it's a loss of potential. And he thought in Oslo we would have the potential to change things. Another person, Hendrik Lubin, he wouldn't be on our advisory panel because he deals with gentrification in Berlin, and it was like, I can't even be associated with something like this. But we were convinced to take part, and I think that's something maybe we learned is like, I think I used to be more of a smash the state kind of kid and revolutionary, and I became a reformist maybe. But that it's way more interesting to participate with high stake developers and people you maybe would never have access to. Do you have anything you want to add to that? Come to the mic a little.
I thought the whole process was interesting, since you don't start with thinking a project, you start with trying to find out what is happening, what is something underground there, and make it manifest. So you try to find what is a community there, and then you saw, I don't know if there is that going back? Yeah, I don't know. Anyway, there was a picture of this workshop we did of like now all these people came together in the first bakehouse, and they started to claim the bakehouse and do their own projects, and started to organize, and started to organize their own garden and their own project in this bakehouse. And so we had sort of community, and then you start to think like, this community, how should this community, how can it work? What kind of social sort of network is this community? How is this physical network? I mean, how can this social network can be represented in a physical network, in an architecture, or in an urban sort of space? And so you think out of the community, not you think for the community, you don't do your research and then can come with a solution for the people for the community because you are an artist or an architect and you know better. No, you take your community and you start to, let the community, give a space where the community can emancipate and become their own physical space. So that's a sort of what we did. And of course that gathers a sort of energy that is already there. You don't have to make something up. It's there, and you make what is not visible manifest. So you don't do a manifestation, you make just what is invisible manifest. And so that is sort of a thing I think we did there. And so because already there is this it's not that you try to find something that is founding your project. Your project is already it has already a foundation. And of course, governments don't need votes, are immediately also enthusiastic to sort of help this project going on. You're not. It's a funny way how it works, but it went by itself more or less. Like we got the support of the government because we had the support of the community already. I mean, we didn't have the support of the community. The community was supporting itself, sort of self-organizing, and that was, I think, sort of an interesting process. That is, yeah, but it needs time.
I was wondering if you personally or collectively had any thoughts or intentions going into it, and perhaps how they changed regarding documentation. I think thinking about it as a project, I suppose the title of the talk was Presence in Practice. And also questioning sort of time and standardization, if you had any thoughts about documentation, if that didn't ever feel right or sometimes it was necessary.
So that's a good question too, and I think it's an important part of a strategy in the beginning. So Claire Doherty was part of the curatorial mastermind of these public art projects. So there are 3 permanent public art projects in this development. And they wanted these projects to be very high profile and super public. Like the other project is called Future Library. It's all over the media. It's in the news all the time. It's on every popular media. It's an amazing project. But they wanted us to also have that happen. So when we made the Canoe Oven, that was our way of broadcasting the project. And they wanted to bring in the media and their big cameras from Britain, and they were amping up this moment. It was our first presence as Flatbread Society, and we said, no, we don't want any media. We want to be purely word of mouth because it's not going to work. We started to meet the people that could possibly be part of something, and if there was a big media crew from Britain coming, it just would kill the spirit of what was starting to emerge. So we even said, we're only going to use smoke signals. That's our mode of communication. And they let us do that. They took some pictures, but they were sympathetic to it. And also, I think we had an advantage that Future Library was getting a lot of press, so we could kind of stand in the shadow. But I think it's something we learned, or I feel like is an interesting strategy, just to kind of resist the documentation. And I think then on the flip side with Seed Journey, we tried that too. Like, let's not bring high definition cameras and have a crew with us. how do we meet the speed of this journey with a documentation process? And what it's become is oral transmission. These lectures are really the way that story's told, or we do have some printed matter, but it works against us in getting funding. You know, people want to see what happened, and they want documentation because that makes it seem more professionalized. So that's a slippery slope. And you, thank you. Thank you to our captains and archivists and able-bodied. Did our able-bodied leave? No, we're still there. Thank you. And thank you, Robert, for having us.